Hello, everybody. This is Jacob, also known as Big Yellow Praxis. I'm here with another episode about underrated music. This is a podcast where I talk with people about music that I think is underrated or overhated, hence the name of the podcast. I cover all kinds of music from progressive rock to folk to blues to funk to pop, anything really. This episode, though, we are going to talk about concept albums, which naturally will incline us towards the progressive, but I don't think exclusively. We'll see where we go with this. We've got some good albums to talk about. I am joined this episode by Peter I knew I was going to get it wrong. Peter Saint Andre from Colorado. Is that right?
Yes.
Yes. Hi. Do you want to just introduce yourself to whatever extent you wish?
Yeah, I'm Peter. I mostly work on technology, but I also write some philosophy and poetry books on the side, and I've also done some little bit of recording, but more something I'm planning to do in the future. But I've definitely been into music for a long time now.
This episode, which talking about, as I said before, concept albums. So we got two choices each. It spans quite a wide breadth, I guess. I don't want to talk too much as a preamble about what a concept album is, but I feel like we need to do it to some extent. So let's do it to some extent. What is a concept album ultimately? Where's the line, I guess? Because to me, it's not just telling. It doesn't need to be a story. That's an obvious concept album, but it can just be a little bit more vague than that, I guess.
Yeah, I think there's a couple ways people have approached it, and there really is no fine line, right? Because you could say that there's some pretty clear examples. You talk about Tales from Topographic Oceans from Yes or something like that, where John Anderson and Steve Howe were up all night putting this album concept together, right? And things like that. And then you have things that, maybe Joni Mitchell's Blue or Blood on the Tracks from Bob Dylan, things like that, where there's kind of a common feeling and around the songs, or a common experience maybe that the person was having at the time. So there's really no, I think, hard and fast rule about a concept album.
Yes, yeah, I think that's true. So I think maybe just as setup before we go into talking about the meat of this episode, let's say what's the most concept album ever, and what's a minimum viable product, I guess. We don't need to be very definitive about it, but I guess for me, something like I was actually talking about it today, Jeff Wayne's War of the Worlds. I don't know if you know it.
Yes.
That's a pure concept album. It's a story through and through. It's completely beginning to end, fits together. And then to me, that's maybe the most concept album you can get. And possibly the least is something like maybe Joni Mitchell's Blue. I think that's kind of the minimum.
Borderline.
Yes, yeah. So I think, I mean, if you don't need to suggest anything, but if we agree that they're maybe the two ends of the spectrum,
that sounds good. Yes.
Yeah, we'll roll with that, and that might help us baseline. We might want to put these albums somewhere on that spectrum, just as a little game throughout. We'll see how that goes. So so we're gonna start with the earliest album on the list. We won't go through them chronologically, but we will start with the earliest, which is an album from 1971 by a band I really like called Caravan. And the album is In the Land of the Grey and Pink. Did you know this album already before
I didn't, Jacob. No. So Thank you for introducing me. I've listened to Caravan, but somehow I missed this one.
Yeah. What are your just general thoughts? Thumbs up, thumbs down? You're not too sure, or just...
Yeah, I liked it a lot. Especially speaking of kind of concept albums, and prog comes to mind. The 9 Feet Underground at the end, it clearly is a classic kind of put it all together, super long form, things like he used to play on long form radio back in the 70s, and late at night someone was putting this on and the vinyl, right, and things like that. And so that sort of certainly has that total concept album feel to it. The other ones I think a little bit less so, just because they weren't that integrated whole side of an album back in the day.
Yes, yeah, no, I totally agree. To me, I guess again, if we're saying what's the minimum borderline, minimum threshold for a concept album, this is more towards that, and I think to me, in the way that Joni Mitchell's Blue, it fits a feel and an idea and a tone. This does that, and it's English whimsy. It's Tolkien-esque fantasy at points. It's fairy tales as well, I guess, but it's not telling one story. But I do still feel that it does fit within that. It's not a collection of singles, for example, is it?
For sure.
Yeah. So you mentioned 9 Feet Underground, which is the 20, I can't remember now, 23-minute long song on
Just about, it seems, yes.
Yes, yeah. And I really like that track. It's not necessarily one of the most popular kind of epics in progressive rock, because I know you like progressive rock a lot, but it's they're not a technically show-offy band, are they? I guess.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. The other thing, you mentioned the Tolkien aspect of things, which I think is interesting. You look at the cover back in the days when people really cared a lot about the covers.
Yes. Yeah.
It definitely has that Tolkien-esque sort of feeling to it. And I think that's one of the things that we have lost in the modern era, where we're just streaming things. And but back in the day, of course, that was part of the whole package, and would kind of, even before, when you were in the record store, it would set the tone, like, oh, what is this, right? And it would set that idea of there's a concept here, right? Not just some random cover that things had.
Yes, yeah, for sure. That's I think that's a really good point. This is actually an album cover I sought out for a few years, because I love the album so much, and I think it's a great piece of art. And it took me a while to find it, actually, but I did find it. And I also have it. I have a mug. I have a mug with the album cover on, which
Nice.
my girlfriend thought was a bit silly, but I've kept it and I love it. It's my favorite mug. I don't even drink tea or coffee, so I don't need a mug, strictly speaking, but I still have it.
Excellent.
Yeah, and I was going to say, yeah, I agree. There's even that, and even over our relatively short email correspondence, that I love the Beach Boys, and it's a joke on this podcast that I love the Beach Boys, and I just do. And their album covers are quite uniformly bad, and something about their album covers signals quite clearly to someone who sees them. Incorrectly signals that this album that you're about to buy, let's say it's the Beach Boys today, or what, it could be any of this, is a collection of singles rather than an album, because it has that kind of pre kind of rock era vibe to it. It's a bunch of guys who
pop.
just,
It's very pop, right?
yes, exactly. And I think, yeah, the album.
Well, see, they were right before. I mean, obviously with Pet Sounds and things like that, they're kind of on that cusp.
Yeah.
But you look at, I don't know if you've ever read, there's a great book by a philosopher named Bill Martin called The Music of Yes. And he delves into that whole progressive rock time period and how that all came about. And he talks about how there was this real kind of, even before the prog stuff started, there was this real experimental rock phase where people were just trying things out, right? And they were mixing jazz and mixing classical and so on. So
Yes.
I think that the Beach Boys were kind of just before that in some ways. And it was probably the marketing machine wanted them to have these sort of pop covers too.
Yes, yeah, absolutely, for sure, yeah. And although I could turn this podcast into another one about the Beach Boys, I won't do it. The wider point is that the first thing you see, or the first thing you used to see with an album, was the album cover. And I mean, I'm 30 years old, so I'm kind of the tail end of CDs in a way. But, I still bought a lot of CDs when I was a teenager. And there's actually one album in particular that my brother, who's only a couple of years older than me, bought solely because of the album cover. And it was an album cover that was actually done by Roger Dean, who did Yes covers,
Right.
by a little band called Magna Carta.
Yes, right.
No, not Yes. That was the other band he did the album. Sorry. And it's a nice little like folk album, but it's a good example. It was actually, I like it more than that. That sounded dismissive. I really like the album, but it's a good example of how it can just suck you in, the album cover.
Yeah.
And I think so. Back to in the Land of the Grey and Pink, which
Yes.
is a great name for an album in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
The album cover does such a good job of just really, for me, again, it's Tolkien-esque and it probably doesn't appeal to everyone. But for me, it really sucks me in. It really draws me in, and I really like it. I'm quite curious where. So I personally think this is a not. It's lower down on the threshold of concept albums. Do you? I think you said you agree. Actually, you did, didn't you?
Yeah, I would call this maybe we're gonna have a scale here from
Yes,
we're gonna rate this on 1 to 10 or something like this. I would say this
I
is
think so.
maybe in the 5-ish, 6-ish range, sort of. I would say
Yeah,
maybe
yeah,
6
six. I
from least to most.
right. Yeah, I see what you mean. So this is where I'm going to get very anal about our numbering system. So is a one still
Ah,
a concept album, but not very much, or is a one not a concept album and you need to hit five at the very least?
oh, I see, I see. No, I would say let's say Joni's Blue is at one, right? So
Right.
it's like just hits the threshold. Everything else is negative, or they're off the other side of the scale there. So
Yes, yeah,
yeah,
yeah. Okay, cool. I'm glad we cleared that because this is important work that we're
very
doing.
important.
um, I would be yeah, I would be inclined to agree because you say you're not necessarily that acquainted with their entire catalog, but you know them a bit.
Yes.
Yeah. So I'm trying to. I don't think they did anything more conceptual than this. I think
Hmm.
they tend to hit around this mark, and in a sense, they're always within the same world of whimsy, if that makes sense. They're all in
Yes.
the same kind of ballpark.
World
But
of Whimsy would be a nice name for an album, wouldn't it?
maybe I should do that. Maybe that's my next project. But I was going to say I did once read, and this was clearly someone more insightful than me because I thought it was a brilliant point they made that a lot of progressive rock bands you can judge their success based on how successfully they create their own little world
Hmm.
or their own big world. I guess it could be a big world.
Right.
And I think they all the big names, Jethro Tull, where Jethro Tull all the way through Pink Floyd, uh, King Crimson, Genesis, whoever. I think they all do that, and I think Caravan. So I may as well give a little bit more history about the band. Had virtually no commercial success whatsoever. I
Yeah.
mean,
Sad too.
yes, and I really think they are remarkably underrated for that. I just and I find it so strange, in fact, that this was the time of abandoned sensibilities and just we'll write a song about whatever we want, and it was commercially rewarded. You've mentioned already Tales from Topographic Oceans. It's almost sublimely nice, if you know what I mean. This music,
Yes. Yes.
because
I like that.
thank you. I genuinely do get a lot out of it even on an emotional level, and it's not rousing in the same way that a lot of very good music is.
Hmm.
Um,
So speaking of sublimely nice, I'm going to suggest we talk about Riverside,
yes, yeah, let's go straight
which
into it.
is a rather a friend of mine here in Colorado introduced me. His name is James. Introduced me to Riverside, and I hadn't listened to them before. They're a Polish band,
Hmm.
obviously in a sort of prog metal kind of. If you listen to some of their other music, it's rather it's a little harder than this.
Hmm.
This is a rather sweet, kind of sublimely nice album
Okay.
too, I would say. Which and so I really like what they've done, and I'm kind of curious your thoughts about it. But we can chat through
Yeah.
this Riverside album called Love, Fear, and the Time Machine.
So it's really interesting you say that they're usually a lot heavier because when I hear Polish prog metal band, I guess or
How
Polish
many
prog,
Polish prog metal bands do you listen to on a regular basis?
well, yeah, not many, but I guess as an overall scene, I know it's there, and I was definitely expecting something heavier. And as soon as the album starts, it sounds quite folksy.
Mm,
Um, I don't know. I tried not to research anything, so I don't know the name of the singer. But he sounds at times a lot like not even any specific person, but like an English folk singer. He has
yes,
that,
yes,
and it's really immediately. Um, I don't think it's necessarily consistent throughout the album, but a pastoral feel to that opening track. It's a
yes.
folksy melody, and it is, I guess, again, I guess it's similar, as you said, to the Caravan album, but in a different way. Caravan aren't technically accomplished and they're not trying to show off. Whereas I felt more of a purposeful restraint on this album, I guess.
Ah, yes, that sounds right. Yeah,
Yeah, and
because I have listened to some of their other stuff, and they more go toward that Steve Howe end of things sometimes, right, where they're really
yes,
kind of showing off what they can
hmm
do, which is
yes,
kind of fun too, right? But
yeah,
it's
yeah,
not no, it's not always in service of the music.
yes, yeah. No, I agree, and I like this album. I definitely need to listen to it more. I sometimes feel when I have people on the podcast and they introduce me to music, I almost feel like, oh my god, is this what it feels like to be put in the spot? Because you almost feel like you can't listen to. I've listened to the Caravan album for years, so I have so much to say about it. But this, I almost feel is you always want a bit more time to listen to it and have more to talk
Yes,
about.
yes. I
Um,
haven't listened to this one that much either.
oh, that's okay.
I only learned of it, I think, last year when my friend James told me about it,
hmm
um, who's a musician too, and thought I might enjoy it.
hmm
Um, it is. I would say this is farther. This is maybe an 8 or something like that on the concept album.
hmm
It's our little concept album scale,
Yes, yeah, yeah.
because it has a story. It's kind of about a person who, if you read the lyrics and listen to the songs, it seems to be about a person who sort of goes back to visit his younger self
hmm
and kind of provides encouragement to that person. And the person at the end in the last track or two, the second to last track, I think, is called Time Travelers.
hmm
And so it's about that same concept. And then at the end, where the sort of the young person feels empowered, kind of, as we would
hmm
say now, or have this new sense of freedom and wisdom that they got from their older self and things
Yes,
like
yeah.
that. And there is kind of a sweetness about that, right?
Yes, yeah.
A sublimely nice, to use your phrase,
Yes, yeah.
feeling about that. And I do think that there's a sense of restraint in the playing and the singing
hmm
and the lyrics. So I really liked how they pulled that off. It's, of course, a standard trope kind of in literature, right, where you
hmm
have this old writing letters to your younger self, or
hmm
someone who is looking for those insights that the person had later in life. But I really like how they did it, and there's a real commonality, I feel, to the soundscape as
Yes.
well of this
hmm
album.
Yes, yeah, yeah, for
And
sure.
that,
And
to me, that's a big part of a concept album, is to have that common view. And I think, the Caravan album has that too.
yes, yeah, yeah, yeah. So this kind of takes it the next step through by actually having, even if we're not talking about the narrative, there's an emotional trajectory of the album, which
Mm,
Caravan didn't really do. Everything's
yes.
similar kind of level, and each song might go up and down, but there's no emotional trajectory to the album. This one
Yes.
definitely has that. You're on a ride, and it's going in a certain direction, and
Hmm.
they really do that well. I think if I were to offer a criticism of this album, it sometimes feels it's maybe an unfair one. I don't know.
A
Because
little
there's
forced, perhaps.
maybe in some regards, the regard I would say is that because it kind of ties back into that sounds a bit like an English folk singer in that the other albums on this list they feel like they've more readily embraced their cultural background, I guess, if that makes sense.
Interesting.
And I feel I don't know enough about, like, for example, and I don't think because you're a Polish band you should do this. I don't know much about Polish folk, and it's almost a shame in a way that they wouldn't integrate that, and it ends up sounding more like English folk. So
Interesting.
it's not actually something that detracts from the listening because it shouldn't. But in a way, it's like I think I'm being slightly unfair. But I think do you see what I
Yes, I
mean?
see where you're going with that.
Yeah.
I would, as you were talking about his sounding, the vocalist sounding a bit like an English folk singer, I was thinking about some other bands, maybe from Scandinavia, like the Flower Kings. I don't know if you listen to much of the
I've
Flower
listened
Kings.
to a bit of them. Yeah.
And their vocalist, I can't remember his name either. He doesn't quite sound so English, right? You can tell he's not singing in his native language, and he's
Yes.
I think
Yeah.
probably Swedish or Norwegian or something like this. I can't.
Mhm.
I think they're from Sweden. I like some of the Flower Kings too. We could have talked about them as a
Mhm.
concept album. I haven't listened to them in some years, but yeah, this is a little bit more. You're right. Folks could be from, up north in England somewhere
I,
almost.
they could at points, and actually, while you were talking, I realized how unfair I was being because let's think about some of the biggest musicians of the 20th century: the Rolling Stones, Elton John. The Beatles, do the Beatles sing in their accent? They mostly don't.
Yeah.
Elton John has an American accent when he sings. The Rolling
Yes.
Stones put an American accent on. It's incredibly common, and I shouldn't have even mentioned that as a criticism. But I guess I couldn't help in a way but feel there was a bit of a lack of embracing something. I don't know. Maybe I
Mm.
just felt there wasn't that sense of abandonment to kind of.
Well, then you these are touchy issues and complex issues, right? So then
Yes,
you
yeah,
talk
yeah.
about like what is authentic.
Yes, yeah, yeah,
If they
exactly.
were a folk band, then you would expect them to be more authentic in their, their embracing of whatever tradition. I Years ago I taught English in Czechoslovakia, and there's Czech folk music, and
Hmm.
that's a different sort of thing, right? And
Hmm.
if and I like some of that music; it's really nice. But then you get into questions of, well, they're not really authentic because they're sounding like something from somewhere else. And we
Hmm.
have the same thing in the States, right? People are sounding like a British band, maybe, or
Yes.
some of these Appalachian music that we have in the States. That came from the border regions between Scotland and England many, many years ago, and
Yeah,
so
yeah.
that can sound. So maybe they start to sound like someone else. It's a fine line, of course, and they might be looking toward more commercial success. I don't. Who knows what's in their minds? But from a musical standpoint, I really like what they did with the album and putting it, having that storyline. I think they did a really fine job of that.
Yes, yeah, oh, yeah, yeah, for sure. Let's not linger on my criticism, which are probably off base anyway. It was this lingering feeling that let's pretend I didn't say it. But no, I totally
We'll
agree
cut that
that
from the podcast in the final edit.
yeah, we can't have like I'm infallible as far as my listeners are concerned. But yeah, no, as I said, there's a real emotional trajectory that I really like, and I really did like the restraint actually because you hear it and you think, oh, yep, they're getting a bit proggy and a bit weird here, but it never goes too. I don't think you can go. There's a lot of yes I like that goes too far. It goes much
Yes.
further than this, but it can still. I can like both. I guess I can like that restraint whilst liking the kind of more extreme prog, and I think it's a real credit to their taste. There's no accounting for taste. You can't. You can play guitar as much as you want, and you're not going to just suddenly by getting faster at playing become more tasteful. And
Mm-hmm.
I've not heard their other music. I assume they can definitely shred it up, but they don't, and that is taste, and that's that kind of very hard to pin down thing.
Mm.
Um, and
There's a lot of intention, I think, behind this. They really thought about what
mhm,
they were trying to do, what they were
yes,
trying to project, and I like that. It's one of the things I like about some of the early the prog bands too, is that they really thought about what they were trying to do
mhm,
and put together, and so that's one thing I really admire about this album.
mhm. Yes, and I think
There's a seriousness of purpose, and that restraint came from not just, oh, let's hold back, but what are we trying to make here?
yes, yeah, 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 yeah. It's conscious and it's deliberate, but it's serious. As soon as you said there's a seriousness of purpose, I guess this is another distinction from Caravan, who are whimsical and silly,
Mm.
one might call them. Are Riverside, it's a serious album. There's not much in the way of humor or whimsy, which is another distinction from a lot of first generation British prog bands, where
Mm.
Jethro Tull and Genesis and Caravan in particular have a wacky sense of humor. And I think you see it a bit less in Yes, and I don't really detect it as much in King Crimson either. Pink Floyd are kind of in between, maybe. Um,
Yes.
and it's one of those things.
Yeah, if you look at the some of the early criticism, the music criticism from the press at the
Mhm,
time, I don't know who was Rolling Stone and those kinds of things. They often didn't like those kinds of bands that were too serious,
mhm.
that were taking themselves too seriously, as they would say, or they had this uh, grandiosity about them, that they were trying to do too much or be too much, and you're not philosophers or theologians, you're rock musicians.
Yes.
Why are you taking yourself so seriously?
Mhm.
uh, I've always found that a little bit of a cheap shot or a knock, that these music journalists sort of It was easier for them to write about bands that maybe were a little bit more fun or didn't take themselves so seriously. And I like these bands that are rather ambitious about what they're trying to do.
Yeah.
And sometimes they fall flat. I think something like Tales from Topographic Ocean, as much as I'm a big Yes fan, kind of falls flat. They were trying to do too much. It was stretch these things out, these 4 pieces that they had over a whole album side and things like that. So I think one can go too far in that direction, but I would rather have a band really try to have this concept, and this is where concept albums kind of come to the fore, is have a concept and put together a story or put together a feeling and try to do something more than just one track or 1 or 2 tracks, or even something like 9 Feet Underground, where they've got that whole 23 minutes that they've put together. I like that. I mean, I think try something new and bigger than just putting together songs here and there, because that to me really shades off into that negative side of the concept album spectrum, where you just have these strong songs that you string together and 3 minutes here and 4 minutes there. There isn't a lot of ambition always behind that, although you can pack a lot into that small campus as well, or canvas rather.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And I do totally agree that it can be a bit of a sneer that people, oh, you're being too serious. And it does feel like just putting people down for having different interests than you. There's almost something of the schoolyard bully to that, actually, I think.
Yes.
I do think, unfortunately, prog rock was, and I think it's seeing a bit of a resurgence. I think people are kind of getting more into it now. More people of my generation, a bit younger, are a little bit less inclined to just basically what it feels like to me the Rolling Stones critics of the time were trying to do to some extent was be too cool for it. And nonetheless, though, I do think whimsy can be an important part of progressive rock, and there's a fine line. There certainly is a fine line. I like that Riverside do not inject too much they don't inject whimsy into this, because I think there's an appropriate time and an inappropriate time. But I think I definitely will listen to their wider catalog, and I think I would like to see, this is purely hypothetical again, I would like to see some whimsy at some point, because it does feel like there's a little bit of playfulness in prog that I would like to see. And yeah, I think I'm just interested. I'm really interested in where they take it, because progressive rock, although it's, there's Dream Theater and there's Rush and there's all these other bands, still is very British in its origins, and that's kind of where its heart lies. And it's always interesting, because I've not listened to any. I've listened to plenty of Italian prog and like Scandinavian prog, but Polish prog I haven't. And I really, it's one of those things, now that I'm introduced to the world of however small a dose of Polish prog, I need to see its own little twists on it. And I think maybe that's all I was saying before, when I was maybe a bit disappointed that it wasn't immediately obvious here, like, what's the Polish twist? But I'm putting way too much on their shoulders for one album. And actually, I'm coming around to say it is great, and the whimsy is neither here nor there. And I'm trying to think now what was folksy about it, because it wasn't just the opening track. There were bits. Do you know more about the band? Like, are they into?
I don't know much. No.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Because maybe it was just the melodicism and that restraint that kind of has a similar sensibility to some kind of folk music, maybe. I found you from the Yes Music podcast, and so which I've listened to for years. I like those guys a lot, and little plug for them. And when I think of someone like Yes, you think about what John Anderson did on his own, very sort of folky stuff. I mean, yeah, there's Elias of Sun Hillow and things like that. That could have been another one of our concept albums, but some Yes songs could have been folk songs. Yes.
Even something like And You and I.
That was the first one I thought of, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's like, so I think John Anderson kind of wrote songs almost like folk songs.
Yeah.
And then, Wakeman would come in and Howe would come in and they would jazz it up, as it were, and prog it up. But there's an element sometimes of their music, and I think that's also obviously true of some of the classic prog folk bands like Fairport Convention and people like that, of course, is that there's a real sort of folk element and people take their folk music very seriously, of course, and so the seriousness of the comes in there as well.
Yes.
But I think then prog kind of doesn't always have that, right? It's these folks, the Riverside, as far as I understand it, they kind of almost put together prog and metal more, and from what I've heard, this is a sort of more of the folky side of them. And I think it is perhaps because it's a bit of a softer side because of the story that they're trying to tell, and this narrative and this arc of the older person visiting with the younger. And I think that's maybe how some of those folk elements came out in this album.
Yeah, I think you might be right, actually. But you've just reminded me, I think we should definitely mention, as we did for In the Land of the Grey and Pink, the album cover, which I think you might have there, just a little.
I do, yeah. Let me see if I've got it. Well, there's actually two things here, but yeah, here's the album cover. Can you see that well?
Yes, yeah. Yep.
Okay.
Nice.
And here, it's not the album. This one has it's not an LP, right? But you've got, you open up the fold kind of like you do in the olden days, right? And you've got the little lyric book, and you can go through there, and it's got different pictures and things like that, right? And so that's sort of part of the same concept album thing, right? Where we've got the whole package here. It's not just the music. There's the visuals that go along with it, and the lyrics that go along with it, and all of that.
Yeah, for sure. So that's something I'm missing because I can only listen to it on Spotify.
Yes.
But seeing it there, that's really nice, and it's a really good album cover. It's really atmospheric, and it just works as a nice piece of art by itself as well, and it really matches. Most importantly, it matches.
Well, like here, right? You've got the little child who's sort of thinking about their future, right? And as the first song comes together and things like that, and there's a little boy here kind of reflecting on the ocean or wherever the little kid is, and it all kind of comes together that way.
Yeah. I think it's really. I really need to listen more broadly within their kind of back catalogue. I definitely will do that. And I think it's time for us to move on to the next album, which feels like we're
going to go on forever here, Jacob, if we don't watch it.
I know. I think we will. And this one's definitely a change in tone because, well, I'll just go straight into it. So it's Ween, the Mollusk, and I think it was from 1997. I should remember the year, but 1997 as far as I remember. And this is a strange band and a strange
yes, they're
album.
A little odd, aren't they?
A little bit, yes. What is your first impression, I guess, though? If
they clearly have a soundscape. I haven't listened to their other stuff, so I don't know. They've got this kind of sea shanty feeling sometimes, and a lot of kind of, I don't know how they made these albums. Did they do them on tape even? I think I was reading sometimes. And there's a lot of little sound effects and little things going on in the background, right? That just come in and come out that aren't, I don't know how they even made some of the sounds that are on here. So it's definitely a very distinctive approach that they have to the very sound of it itself.
Yes, yeah. So their earlier stuff certainly would have been done quite DIY on tape and stuff. But by this point they've never been massive commercially. One of the songs from this album was actually, what's the song called again? Ocean Man. I love the song Ocean Man. Very catchy kind of pop tune that is used in the SpongeBob SquarePants movie from quite a while ago.
Yes, I saw that. Yeah.
And so by this point, they're recording in a proper studio, and it's very well recorded. And I agree, there is lots of strange noises in it, and I think this is. I mean, it definitely is. It's taking whimsy of something more like Caravan even further. It's into not satirical inherently, maybe at points, but it's very wacky. It's wacky. There we go. It's
wacky. That's a good word for it. Yes.
Yeah. And so they are. I don't know how to sum them up as a band. They almost have something of the Frank Zappa about them in terms of.
That's a great connection. Yes.
Yeah. Jumping, I think they're less political. Is it fair to call Frank Zappa political? He could be quite political. They're less political than that, but they will jump from genre to genre, sometimes in the span of one album, like this one, or they had one album called 12 Country Greats, I think that's what it's called, which was just before this, and that's just a country album. And
interesting. Wow.
Lyrically, the themes are, in many ways, they're subverting like standard lyrical tropes that you would hear in country. And for one example on that album, basically what they do a few times on that country album, in fact, is they take what is undeniably, unfortunately, a part of country music is like just casual misogyny, and they essentially just dial it up to 11 to a kind of Frank Zappa-esque level of satire by just doing it in the most grossly offensive way, which is unpleasant listening in one way, but then they write these catchy songs.
Yeah, there's one song on this album that's that way too. I can't remember which one it was.
Yeah, well, there's Waving My Dick is one of the songs, so that's
That was probably it then, yes.
yes, Waving My Dick in the Wind.
I'm waving my dick in the wind. I'm waving my dick in the wind. If it all goes right, I'll be in your arms tonight. But I'm waving my dick in the wind. I'm lost in the sauce once again. I'm lost in the sauce once again.
I think is catchy, but at the same time is a surreal experience alongside some of the other songs on the album, which I think don't need to be taken as a joke to be genuinely enjoyable. So for me, Buckingham Green, I really enjoy. It's possibly the heaviest song on the album.
Made a mother cry.
It feels to me like they're channeling a bit of King Crimson there. It has almost that 21st century Schizoid Man type of vibe. And I'm just looking at the track listing now, and I'm thinking about each song one by one. I forget how diverse an album it actually is. As you say, we go through almost like synth punky type songs to, I don't know how to describe some of these, folk songs, sea shanties, straightforward pop songs.
It's quite the wild ride.
Yes, it is quite the wild ride. And I was going to say, so one of the songs on the album is actually a cover, now that I look at this track listing again. So it's called Blows the Wind. It's actually...
Oh, is that a cover, really?
Yes, it's an old like English folk song.
I'll do as much for my true love as any young girl.
Usually called Unquiet Grave, which you may have heard, or maybe you haven't. But it's one of the first times I heard this song was, do you know the, again, very progressive folk band, Griffin?
I have not listened to Griffin.
So they're very, again, very eccentric, but very different type of eccentric to this. They are full blown kind of, I mean, they play like the crumb horn and the bassoon and lutes and lyres and things like that. They're much more like that Elizabethan folk turned into a kind of 70s rock band. And they do a great cover with, you know, I don't know, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 crumb horns overdubbed of The Unquiet Grave, which is essentially the same song as called Blows the Wind. And yeah, so Ween, actually they treat it quite seriously here. They're not completely subverting the song, which in a way is odd for them. I really like it though. So when you listen to that song, did you just think, oh, it's a folksy song, I guess? So
Yeah, I didn't know the backstory of it. I guess I was just listening to it as music.
yes, yeah, no, it's because once you hear other like a Griffin approach, when you hear Griffin and their approach to it, the kind of old traditional English folk songness of it really is brought forward. Whereas here it sounds a bit more 90s alt rock take on folk, I guess.
So where do you feel that this one falls on our little, because it is this wild ride, and you're going back and forth between these different kinds of music almost, like you say. Where do you think that sort of the theme or the conceptual aspect of it comes from?
So this is strange. I would be inclined to give it the same score as In the Land of the Grey and Pink, whilst also struggling to put into words what the concept is. Because at least with the Caravan album, I could say it's Tolkien-esque whimsy. Whereas with this, satirical isn't enough of a concept. Subversive and wacky is not enough of a concept. it's always felt to me like a satirical take on progressive rock in a way, and a lot of people think the same of this. But having not really necessarily read any interview where the band themselves can have either confirmed or denied it, I'm struggling to put my finger on why I'm saying that precisely. I think it's probably, I don't. Maybe I shouldn't just blather on endlessly. Where would you put it?
Well, I might put a little bit. It has all, like I say, sort of these funky sounds all over the place. Almost, I think of like the Beatles sometimes did that kind of thing, like for the benefit of Mr. Kite or something like that. We just had these weird sounds going on all over the place. And so there's a little bit of that going on here, I think. It's hard to. There aren't any of those sort of classically long songs that you would hear on a prog album, right? Not that albums need to have those kinds of things, but I almost feel like if someone were satirizing progressive rock, they would have thrown in some sort of 8-minute,
that is true. That is
pastiche
true.
Even of things. But the songs on here do sort of sometimes run almost into each other. I feel like almost like a suite here and there. So maybe that is a little bit of what you're hearing here.
Yeah, it's such an odd album that it's ineffable, I think, in a way. So if we had to kind of settle on a score, then, so we did say on the concept album scale, In the Land of the Grey and Pink was 5. I think we said.
Yeah, I think I had a 5 or a 6. I wasn't quite sure, but yeah.
Yeah. Well, so would you put this above it or below that?
I would say this more like a 4 or so myself. 4. I didn't listen to it as many times. I didn't like it as much as I like Caravan. I have to admit to you. So I didn't listen to it as much either.
That's perfectly. I'm inclined. I'll agree. I think I'll allow it. You're the guest. You can set the terms here. Because I think that's what I'm trying. Instinctively I kind of want to put it at 6, but there's nothing I can use as evidence to back up that opinion. It's just because looking at it now, it is quite disjointed. Actually, I think there probably are 1 or 2 tracks I do tend to skip actually when I listen to this, and I do still like the album, and I think it's great fun. And I probably went through a period when I listened to it a lot more, and I liked the band Ween more. I still do like them, but looking at it now, I think a 4 is fair. We'll shake.
And by the way, when we're giving those numbers, we're not saying that's a ranking of what it is. It's just where it is on our little spectrum that we put together here. Yeah,
exactly, for sure. Yeah. We're not saying you're a 4 out of 10 Ween, don't worry. Certainly not saying that.
Although then that gets into something of a bit of a, what was the word you used before with these critics?
Sneer,
right? That, it's good of its kind.
Yeah. No, which, certainly not doing that. I mean, so for example, I think I saw I've talked to a few people about this, and someone said, "Is it bad for me to say my favorite album is a greatest hits?" And I think no. If that's your favorite, if your favorite album is the greatest hits of a band you really like, that's perfectly. There's no sneer here. I don't think concept albums are the pinnacle of music at all. And
see, that's something interesting though. I just want to linger on that one for a moment.
Yeah, sure.
Because with the way people listen to music now, we've almost lost the concept of an album. Because you play me some Pink Floyd, and you talk to your Alexa device or something like that. What does it do? It puts it on shuffle play, and you get this song and that song. That's partly why I admire these bands, even nowadays. Someone like Riverside putting together an album and thinking about it in terms of an album, because I think we've really almost, just leaving concept albums aside, we've almost lost the concept of the album at this point. And it's rather sad, because I do like it when those bands try to put together a whole thing as opposed to just string some songs together.
Yes, for sure.
Maybe I'm just a music snob. I don't know, Jacob, but I really like that when people try to do that. Yeah, no,
I do totally agree. And I certainly don't want to say I'm against it. I mean, I definitely love concept albums, but I think, this is certainly something I could talk about forever, but this is a point I like to make with people, that I've met people who have been quite sneering about people who do like their favorite albums are greatest hits, or someone who would say,
Right.
"Oh, I would never listen to a greatest hits." So, like, what's the best album by this band? And there's some bands that I don't think really put out a great album, but I think are great bands because they've still done tons of great material. And there's a few people I've met who do sneer at that a bit, and
Right.
I
I've
do
heard
like
that too.
yeah, and I think it's a shame, and I do like to remind people that I think some people are of the mindset that an album, and therefore a concept album in particular, is a kind of inherently superior form of art, which is also inherently less subject to commercial pressure. I think that's part of the angle they like to make. And I do like to remind people that an album is still a contingent commercial product of its time.
Yes.
It's not the platonic thing that music should be.
Yes.
It should just be part of the smorgasbord of music that is kind of available to us. And yeah, I agree that losing that would be a shame. I don't think we've fully lost it yet, but I do agree it would be a shame. And I think there's enough music in the world and enough listeners that I think we can enjoy both. And I think you agree. It sounds like you agree.
Yeah, and you're right. It is contingent upon what the technologies at the time. If you go back and listen to maybe Billie Holiday or someone like that in jazz, right? They only had 78s back then. So everything had to fit within 3 minutes or so. And that's probably where we got the 3-minute pop song from. They couldn't record the longer kind of jam sessions until they had the LP. And then you had, Kind of Blue and albums like that where they would have these longer songs. It does no knock against, Louis Armstrong or Billie Holiday or something like that. That's so much of what's recorded is just from that time period because, or has those time limitations because that's all they had back then.
Yeah.
The album certainly came into the fore with the LP, and we don't listen to vinyl very much anymore. Some folks still like that, but that's not really the form that we have that people put the things together in. And so we, I agree with you. I'm not utterly snobbish about, it's got to have an album that you've put together, but I like that ambition behind it, I guess, of trying to fill that space in an intelligent way.
Yes. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I totally agree. And I think filling space in an intelligent way is a great segue into our final album, which is Hem. What was it called again?
Departure and Farewell.
Departure and Farewell.
And pins a shadow to the lawn and sweeps across the empty.
So this album was completely new to me, so I'm just going to get it out. I don't know anything about the band, but I saved this last for a reason because I loved this. I thought this was great, and there's so many things I kind of want to say, but the first one is that there were so many songs on this album. As soon as it started, there's just these emotions just started like rising up in me, and I don't. We can talk through it, but my instinct is I don't know how it's doing this to me.
Well, I think part of it. I discovered this band through another friend of mine, a guy named Kurt, who lives on the East Coast of the U.S. and I hadn't heard of them either. Here's another band that did not have, this is their last album, or at least the last album that they've done. And I think Departure and Farewell is part of that. I think they conceived of this as a last album. The orchestrations are really neat. I love how they put together sort of the folky elements and the Americana elements and the classical stuff with I think the orchestrations are quite fine. Sally Ellison, who's their vocalist, I think just has one of the most gorgeous voices I've ever heard. I'm a big Sandy Denny fan, as I know you are.
Yes, I am.
And she has an amazing voice. Annie Haslam, of course, from Renaissance, and the vocalist for him is just amazing to me. And so there's a lot of emotion that she builds into her singing. That I think that's a lot of where that comes from.
Yes, yeah, I think so. I was occasionally reminded of Eva Cassidy, but I think that was also just the wider. I mean, Eva Cassidy's Songbird album is a very Americana album at points as well, and I think it had a similar production style at points. And it's not even just her voice, which I agree I really, really, really loved, but just there's something about like just a piano chord just starts straight away, and I don't know like where this emotion came from. It just wells up. And it's beautifully produced, and there's something so American about it. And
Hmm.
I and I know some people might use that as an insult. I don't in any way, but it sounds it. And I got my girlfriend to listen to it, and I was just like, "What? Listen to the first 5 seconds of this. Why is this so American?" There's something about, and the closest thing. I mean, it's to some degree you have it's almost bluegrassy sounds, and those kind of
Yes, yes.
seventh chords in folk are automatically going to start sounding like that. But part of it is also just the space that you hear within the music.
Mm.
And an analogy I might use is that British folk, when it sounds very British, either sounds like a quaint valley or a village, or it sounds like it's in a dingy pub. And that's kind of what gives it that Britishness. Whereas to me, and I'm getting very vague here, American folk has much more of the sound of open spaces and
Interesting.
bigness. And I may be projecting to some degree, but I really, I just, sometimes I just heard it within the first few bars of a song before the vocals even came in. And obviously her voice is American. You can hear the American accent. But I was reminded at points of, do you know Bela Fleck, the banjo
Yes,
player?
yeah.
And Edgar Meyer, who's
Yep.
so
Yeah, I'm a
the,
big Edgar Meyer fan, yes.
I think some of those sounds are similar production as well to some degree. Again, it
Yes.
sounds open, and it's that Americana. Sliding Down is the track in particular by Edgar Meyer that
Mm.
I thought of at points, and yeah, there's just
Now, what's interesting is Hem is based or was, I guess, probably at this point based in Brooklyn, New York. So
right. Okay,
they've
really,
got the city thing going on, right?
yes, yeah, yeah.
But I think some of the band members did come from Ohio or someplace like that, right? And
Hmm.
so they maybe have that little bit more sense of open spaces and
Right, yeah, yeah,
but there is a spaciousness in the music too. I think that you're getting at
yes, yeah,
where
yeah.
they don't clutter it up too much. Sometimes
Hmm.
they'll have a very sparse sort of arrangement, and then
Hmm.
it will swell up when they've got this background orchestra that comes in and things like
Yes, yeah,
that.
yeah.
And I think they do a very good job of dynamics
Hmm.
and this welling sort of sound that they can get sometimes. And then they'll go back down or start off with something a lot more spare, just with a piano or guitar or a couple
Yes, yeah.
instruments.
Yeah, I think it wells up. That's the way to describe it. It's completely perfect, and I found it really interesting in this album all the way throughout it. In a way, one could say it's samey because they're not thrashing and then calm, and they're not doing funk and then a different genre. But within that, I'm hearing, as you said before, there's bluegrass, there's folk, there's orchestral stuff, there's gospel, and there's hymnic music,
Hmm.
and it really just melded together into this really unique, without being obviously obscure or weird or eccentric music that was really, again, it could only be made by Americans. It's that uniquely.
Interesting.
I don't know why it's so strange, because I think my girlfriend was slightly less struck by the Americanness of it, but I just heard it straight away, and I really liked that
Interesting.
about it. I mean, so I play banjo as well. You can't see it because it's like here on the wall,
Hmm.
and I'm not necessarily massive into bluegrass, but there's banjo and Appalachian music and stuff like that I really like, and there's yeah, I think so. I think the point I would like to get to is that this, again, I don't mean to be unfair to Riverside, but this felt like much more of an embracing of their background,
Yes,
and
yes.
I really liked that. This is one of those albums where I'm just going to keep saying I really liked it, which is not always the most insightful thing, but yeah.
Well, I think one of the things I like about Hem is that they aren't thrashing, right? But they are very good musicians. They
Hmm.
really are very tasteful. You were talking about taste. They're very tasteful about the fills that they have and the how they combine the instruments. And one of the things that, going back to Bill Martin, that he talks about in Prague is that according to him, what happens a lot in prog music is that it doesn't have that one musical center all the time. So they'll have, the keyboards will be featured or something, as opposed to, let's say, Elton John. You met Elton John, it's always about the piano, right?
Yes.
Almost always about the piano. But in here, right, they're changing. Sometimes they'll have songs without the piano, and sometimes they'll have songs that are without the guitar and things like that. And so they have this. The center of musical focus changes a lot from song to song, or even within a song. And that's one of the things that Bill Martin talks about in his Music of Yes book as something that's rather distinctive of progressive music. And I think they have a little bit of that element too going on here.
Yes, yeah, I definitely think they do, yeah. And it's interesting because, yeah, it's a concept. Well, we'll talk about how much, we'll number it in a bit, but it's not progressive in the way that it's not from the tradition of progressive rock. But, and again, this is, I think a lot of people might think I try to do this. I'm not just trying to shoehorn things into progressive, because there's still that element to it. It's better to say that certain things within progressive rock are common in other things, and it shares it in a way that someone like Stevie Wonder is not progressive rock, but there are things he's doing conceptually or in terms of complexity or whatever that are commonalities with it. And I really think that they're pulling through some of those conceptual, again, not just in terms of this is a concept album, but the way they're thinking about music and organizing sounds. I definitely think so.
So I think part of what makes this feel conceptual to me at some level is not there's some of that, but I think it's more of, it's not a story like you have with Riverside, but it is. If you read some of the interviews with the band, I do think it was conceived as this breakup album for them, and I think they sort of broke up amicably, but they just sort of ran out of steam. They weren't having commercial success. It's hard to keep a band together, especially one that has 5-6 members or however many they had. It was also the main person who wrote the songs was breaking up with his wife at the time, as I understand it. And so if you read the lyrics, there's a lot of these departures and farewells and so long and goodbye. And he was trying to almost make it, we were talking about Riverside having this kind of sweetness or sublimely nice. He was trying to be sublimely nice to his partner that he was breaking up with at the time. So the songs have that, I think, a common theme there. It's not so much, does that make it a concept album? I don't know, but there is some thematic consistency to what they were doing.
Yes, yeah. And I totally, it's now that I know some of the background to it, I was listening to it, and every moment of sweetness had that kind of feeling of sadness, and every moment of sadness had a moment of sweetness within it.
Interesting, yeah.
It's just, and again, not to mention the Beach Boys too much, but that's what they do. It's this kind. They're the in a way, in the public perception, they're the cheesiest of the pop bands. But there's this sadness all the way through it, and they can still do a very sad song. There's still happiness throughout it, and this album really was able to do that. And it was elegant. Is kind of what I would probably sum it up best as. There's a real elegance to the way everything was crafted, and again, serious. It was serious. They're not. And again, I don't mean that it doesn't sound to be po-faced, and I'm certainly not sneering at their seriousness, but it's purposeful and serious, and I don't think I heard a single sound on the album that was out of place. I really just, I loved it. I don't know how many times I can just say the same thing. It was really
They do have some slightly more whimsical songs on some of their other albums. If you listen to some of their other music.
I could imagine. And that certainly wouldn't be out of place, but I'm just, as a whole, this fits together really as just this unified statement towards one end. And I really liked that. And I thought, and again, it's funny in a way, actually, because I was so enraptured in the music. I'm not sure how much of a concept I did pick up, as you kind of say. I was picking up on the kind of unified theme, but I'm not always the most lyrically oriented person until I've really started to know an album quite well. And this
here again, I've got the album here, right? So I've got the lyrics, I can read them, and they've got a little booklet and all those kinds of things. And so I think the cover art has this sort of bleeding heart on it and things like that, right? So they had that kind of same trying to have this concept that they put together, even from the visual aspect. And I miss the old albums because they really had that more of that feeling. So that's sometimes why I still buy the CDs of things, just because I'm trying to get that visual aspect of things as well. So I'm not sure where I would put this on the concept album, our little concept album scale. I might make it more of a kind of like a 6 or a 7, simply because it has that theme that goes throughout of this breakup, both of the band and of this person in their relationship.
Yes, I think we might have to compromise on a 6.5.
Okay, 6. Let's call it a 6.
Okay, we'll call it a 6. Because I think it's as far as one can go without having that kind of unified story, if you know what I mean. This is. It's as unified as one can take it without having, I can follow the story through it, or I can follow a specific trajectory. I think 6 is good, and
6 it is.
Yeah. But I'd have to personally, from what I've listened to it so far, and I need to keep listening to it. It's one of those things you have to keep digesting. I'd give this a 10 as an album. I hate giving albums a rating, a numerical.
It's very fine, and like you said, there's nothing out of place.
Yeah. It really struck me, and that's what I'm looking for in music, is that emotional oof, and it really struck me, and I need to keep listening to it. It really, sorry, I'm just repeating.
Well, I'm glad I was able to introduce you.
I'm glad as well.
That's part of what we need to all be introducing each other to the best music that we can find. And I always appreciate it when friends like Kurt, my friend Kurt, introduced me to him, and James, who told me about Riverside. And I didn't know about Ween before we talked. So that's part of what your podcast is about. Here's these things that are underrated. No one's ever heard of them, but there's wonderful music there.
Yeah, I totally agree. I guess I have to thank your friends Kurt and James as well then for introducing you and eventually percolating through me. But I think this is a perfect place for us to wrap up.
Yes.
So for anyone listening, you'll find me on YouTube if you're listening to me on Spotify or elsewhere. Big Yellow Praxis. I do videos about music. I play music. I do lots of stuff. Check me out. Pete, do you want to... Pete, sorry, do people call you Pete? I've shortened it already.
Only my family calls me Pete. But it's been a pleasure, Jacob. Really enjoyed the conversation. And one of these years, I'll start doing some more recording, and maybe you can have me back at that point.
Yeah, for sure, definitely. Yeah, I'd love to do that. Anyway, thanks very much for your time. It's been great talking to you.
It has, indeed. Let's do it again sometime.